I still remember the way David crossed his arms as he leaned against the doorway of the conference room. He didn't even bother to sit down. "We've decided to go in another direction," he said flatly, eyes skimming over the folder in his hand like my application was an old receipt he couldn't wait to throw away. I felt my throat tighten. All the hours I'd spent preparing for those interviews, every late night perfecting my portfolio, every early morning rehearsing the company's mission statement, flashed behind my eyes in one ugly rush. "But you said I was a top candidate," I managed to whisper. My voice sounded small, even to me. David shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "It's not personal, Olivia. It's just the fit isn't quite there." He pushed the folder toward me, like a final courtesy, then turned and walked away. I didn't follow him. I didn't cry. I just stood there, staring at the empty doorway, feeling something inside me go very, very still. If you had asked me back then why I cared so much about getting that job, I probably would have given you a practical answer, something about career growth or financial stability. But the truth was simpler and uglier. I was tired of feeling like an afterthought. I grew up in a split-level house on Cedar Street in Des Moines, Iowa, with a mother who loved my older brother, Ethan, in a way she never quite managed to love me. It wasn't that she hated me. It was more like she forgot I existed unless I was cleaning up after everyone or making myself useful. When Ethan made the varsity baseball team, she threw a backyard barbecue that lasted until midnight. I remember watching her hug him over and over, her voice hoarse from cheering. That night, she forgot to say goodnight to me. I lay awake listening to the music thump through the walls, telling myself it didn't matter. It always mattered. I learned early that if I wanted any attention at all, I had to earn it. Straight A's. Perfect attendance. Volunteering to tutor other kids. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I was good enough, someone would notice me. Someone would think I was worth celebrating. But no matter what I did, Ethan was always the one who got the spotlight. At my high school graduation, I was the valedictorian. I wrote a speech that took me 3 weeks to perfect. When I stepped down from the podium, heart hammering, Mom barely looked up from her phone. "Ethan's coming by later," she said, scrolling. "He wants to show us his new truck." That was it. No hug, no "I'm proud of you." So I stopped expecting those words from her. Instead, I funneled all that hunger for approval into my work. College was my escape. I applied to the University of Chicago, partly because it was the furthest place I could imagine from Iowa without needing a passport. When my acceptance letter came, I packed my things and left before Ethan got home from his shift at the dealership. I thought distance would change something, but it didn't. Mom still called Ethan more than me. On the rare occasion she did call, she mostly talked about his life. The promotions he didn't deserve, the family he was starting with his girlfriend, the new house they were buying together. And then she'd say, "Are you doing okay?" in a tone that told me she already assumed the answer was no. I stopped calling back. I threw myself into my studies and internships. I learned to keep my head down, to outwork everyone in the room. That was how I ended up applying for the job at Klein and Morris. It wasn't just any company. It was the most respected commercial real estate firm in Chicago. Getting hired there would have meant security, respect, and proof that I had finally done something worthy of acknowledgement. I made it through the first 2 rounds of interviews, each one more grueling than the last. By the 3rd round, I could recite the company's history by heart, name every executive on the board, and describe in detail how I'd help expand their urban redevelopment division. When David called to schedule a final meeting, I thought, maybe stupidly, that this was it. The moment when all the years of trying would finally pay off. The night before my final interview, I called my mom. I don't know why. Some old part of me still believed she'd be proud, or at least pretend to be. "Hey, Mom," I began, trying to keep my voice light. "I have my last interview tomorrow, with the senior partner." There was a pause. I could hear the TV in the background. "That's good," she said finally. "Anyway, Ethan's thinking about applying for a regional manager role. Can you believe it? He might get a company car." I felt the familiar hollow ache in my chest. "Yeah," I said quietly. "That's great." We hung up 5 minutes later. She never asked which company was interviewing me. That was the story of my life. Working twice as hard to earn half the attention. But even though I'd learned not to expect approval, a part of me still believed that getting that job would be the thing that changed everything. That if I wore the right suit, said the right words, proved I was indispensable, someone would finally look at me and see something other than a girl who is never quite enough. So when David told me they were going in another direction, it wasn't just a professional rejection. It felt like every disappointment I'd ever swallowed was rising up in my throat, daring me to finally admit how much it hurt. I walked out of that office building on West Monroe Street, my heels clicking too loudly on the marble floor, and wondered how many times a person could be invisible before they stopped trying to be seen at all. Maybe the saddest part was that I still held on to some tiny hope my mom would care. That she'd answer when I called. That she'd ask, "How did it go?" in the same eager tone she reserved for Ethan. I called her that night anyway. The phone rang 6 times before voicemail picked up. I didn't leave a message. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, turned off the light, and sat alone in the dark, too tired to cry. The morning after the rejection, I woke up in my tiny studio apartment with a sour taste of disappointment still coating my tongue. I lay there staring at the cracked plaster on the ceiling, wondering if I should even bother getting dressed. But habit was stronger than heartbreak. I pulled on my gray pantsuit, the one I'd bought on sale at Macy's with the last of my savings. It was supposed to be my interview suit, the armor that made me look like I belonged. Now it just felt like a costume. I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hands, scrolling through my email again, as if the rejection might have magically disappeared overnight. But it hadn't. Subject: Application status, Klein and Morris. From David Cross. Date: 7:42 p.m. Olivia, thank you for your time and effort throughout our interview process. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with another candidate. We appreciate your interest and wish you all the best in your career. Sincerely, David Cross. I must have read those lines 50 times already. They still felt like a slap. My phone buzzed suddenly, and for one stupid, hopeful second, I thought maybe it was David calling to say he'd made a mistake. But when I looked at the screen, I saw my mom's name. "Hello," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi, Liv," she began, in that distracted tone she used when she was doing something else. "Just calling to let you know your brother's going to be on the news tonight. Channel 9 is doing a segment on his dealership's community outreach." "That's great," I said. "You should watch it," she went on. "I'm so proud of him." I closed my eyes. "Did you get my message?" "What message?" I swallowed. "About my interview." "Oh." A pause. "No, I don't think so. But listen, everything happens for a reason, honey. You'll find something eventually. Maybe you were aiming a little too high with that company. You know how competitive it is." I didn't answer. "It's probably for the best," she added breezily. "Less stress that way." I pressed my lips together to keep from saying something I'd regret. "Anyway, I have to go. Ethan's coming over for dinner," she finished. "Call me later, okay?" "Sure," I murmured. The line clicked dead. I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked exhausted, hollowed out. I thought of all the times I'd believed that working harder would finally make someone proud. All the times I'd convinced myself that if I could just accomplish enough, I'd be worthy of love. A second later, another message came in. It was from the HR coordinator at Klein and Morris. "Hi, Olivia. Just confirming you've received David's email. Let us know if you'd like to be considered for other opportunities in the future." Other opportunities. I didn't reply. Instead, I set my phone down and walked into the bathroom. I turned on the light, and for a moment I just stared at myself in the mirror, taking in the smudges under my eyes, the too thin face, the way my blazer gaped at the shoulders because I'd lost weight again. I felt something shift inside me, subtle but undeniable. A tiny voice I'd always ignored whispered, "You don't have to keep begging people to see you." I didn't know what that meant yet, but for the first time, I was willing to find out. 2 days later, the HR coordinator called again. "Olivia? Just following up," she chirped. "Would you be interested in applying for a junior assistant role in our suburban office?" It's a little less strategic, but it might be a good fit. I imagine sitting at a cubicle in Naperville, making half the salary, taking notes for a team that would never see me as anything more than backup. No, I heard myself say. I'm not interested. Oh, she stammered, surprised. Well, all right. Best of luck. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, but it wasn't fear. It was something that felt dangerously close to freedom. That evening, I got a text from Melissa, a girl I'd gone to grad school with. Saw your LinkedIn update.
Sorry about the job.
But hey, come to happy hour Friday. You can vent all you want. I almost said yes. But then I thought about sitting around a high-top table while everyone compared salaries and promotions, while I tried to pretend I was okay. I typed back, "Thanks, but I'm taking some time for myself." She didn't reply. I spent the rest of the week avoiding calls and messages, ignoring every notification. For once, I didn't want to explain myself. I thought about what my mom said, maybe you were aiming too high, and realized that was her whole philosophy in life. Keep your expectations low so you never have to be disappointed. But what if disappointment was better than invisibility? What if wanting more wasn't a flaw? By Sunday night, I knew I couldn't go back to applying for the same jobs. Something in me had shifted for good. I didn't make any big announcement. There was no dramatic post on social media, no tearful call to my mother declaring I was done trying to please everyone. I just stopped. At first, it felt unnatural. My life had always revolved around proving I was worth something, to my family, my professors, my employers. Without that constant pressure, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. The first thing I did was clear out my closet. I pulled every interview outfit off the hangers, folded them into neat piles, and drove them to Goodwill. As I set the bags down on the donation table, a woman with tired eyes smiled at me and murmured, "Thank you." I nodded, but inside, I felt something unclench. After that, I opened my laptop and deleted every bookmarked job listing. Every single one. I unsubscribed from the alerts I'd set up on career websites, the ones that used to ping me at all hours with fresh reminders of my inadequacy. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mom. Not Ethan. Not even the few friends I still talk to. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to be seen. At first, I thought the silence would swallow me. But instead, it felt like a wide, peaceful emptiness. I started walking every morning before dawn. Chicago in early spring was still cold enough that my breath came out in clouds, but I didn't mind. I liked the way the city looked when it was still half asleep, the shop windows dark, the sidewalks almost empty. Sometimes I would stand across the street from the Klein and Morris building, watching the cleaning crews arrive to vacuum the lobby. I wondered if David ever thought about me. Probably not. One morning, as I stood there with my hands stuffed in my pockets, I realized I didn't care if he remembered me or not. He'd been a chapter in my story, not the whole book. A week later, I sat down and opened a fresh notebook. I wrote a question at the top of the first page. What do you actually want? It was such a simple question, but it stopped me cold. I'd spent so many years trying to become what other people wanted that I'd never thought about what I wanted. The answer came slowly in fragments. I wanted independence. I wanted work that felt meaningful. And, maybe most of all, I wanted to know how it felt to belong to myself, rather than to other people's expectations. That night, I called my mom out of habit. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, Liv," she said, her voice warm in that way it only ever was when she was about to talk about Ethan.
"Hi," I said.
There was a pause. "I heard about the job," she continued. "Ethan said maybe you should apply at his company. He could get you an interview." I closed my eyes. "No," I said quietly. "No. I'm not interested." "Well, don't be stubborn," she began. "It's a good company and—" I said no. I interrupted, my voice calm. For a moment, she didn't answer. I imagined her sitting in her kitchen in Iowa, frowning into the phone, trying to figure out what had changed. But I didn't owe her an explanation. "I have to go," I said simply. "Take care." I hung up before she could respond. After that, the call stopped. The text slowed to a trickle. At first, I felt a little guilty. Then I felt relief. I canceled the monthly transfer I'd been sending my mom to help with bills. She never acknowledged it, but I knew she'd notice. I also closed the shared savings account I'd opened in college to help Ethan with his first down payment. I'd been funding it quietly for years, telling myself it was just what you did for family. But family should go both ways, and in my life, it never had. I shut down my LinkedIn profile. I turned off the notifications from my professional associations. I didn't tell anyone why. Instead, I spent long afternoons in the library, reading books about entrepreneurship, real estate, and small business finance. I started researching vacant commercial properties on the South Side, old buildings that had been left to decay because no one believed they were worth saving. The more I learned, the more an idea began to take shape. Maybe I didn't have to beg someone to hire me. Maybe I could build something of my own. It wasn't an epiphany so much as a quiet realization. I had been waiting my whole life for permission I didn't need. One evening, as the sun was setting over the lake, I stood on the roof of my building and looked out over the skyline. The air was crisp, and the lights in the skyscrapers were just starting to blink on. For the first time, I felt something like peace. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I didn't have a trust fund. I didn't have family connections. But I had survived being overlooked and underestimated for nearly 30 years. And I was still here. Maybe that was enough to start. I didn't expect anyone to notice the change in me. In fact, I assumed I would drift so far off everyone's radar that I'd eventually just disappear, another failed dreamer in a city full of them. But life has a way of dropping unexpected allies into your path, people who see you more clearly than you see yourself. Her name was Grace. I met her at a networking event I almost didn't attend. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of damp, chilly spring night that makes you want to crawl into bed and stay there. But some tiny spark, nudged me out the door. The event was held in the lobby of an old Art Deco office building that had been half renovated into co-working spaces. Edison bulbs dangled from the ceiling. The tables were crowded with real estate developers, startup founders, and nonprofit directors, all clutching plastic cups of white wine and business cards. I stood near the back, trying to decide if I should just slip out quietly. That's when Grace tapped me on the shoulder. "You look exactly how I feel," she said, her voice warm. I blinked at her. She was older than me, maybe mid-40s, with a silver streak through her dark hair and kind brown eyes. "Sorry," I managed. She laughed. "Like you're calculating how fast you can leave without being rude." I couldn't help it, I smiled. "That obvious, huh?" She nodded. "I hate these things. But sometimes you meet the right person." I hesitated. "Are you with a company here?" "I run a community development nonprofit," she said. "We help rehabilitate neglected commercial buildings and turn them into spaces that actually serve people, clinics, co-ops, affordable offices." I felt something in my chest tighten. "That's incredible," I said honestly. She studied me for a moment. "What about you?" "You in real estate?" "Not exactly," I said, glancing down. "I'm trying to figure out what comes next." Grace tilted her head. "That's honest. Most people here are so busy selling themselves, they forget to be human." She held out her hand. "I'm Grace Callahan." "Olivia Morgan," I replied, shaking her hand. For the next hour, we stood by the catering table, talking. I told her the bare outline of my story. The rejection, the feeling of never quite belonging, the idea that maybe I could build something instead of begging to be included. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she just nodded. "You remind me of myself," she said quietly, before I stopped waiting for someone to pick me. I didn't know what to say to that. A week later, Grace emailed me an article about small-scale urban redevelopment. Beneath the link, she'd written, "Just in case you decide to bet on yourself. You'd be good at this, Olivia. Better than you think." I read that line over and over. Nobody had ever said anything like that to me. Not my family, not my professors, not my bosses. The next time we met for coffee, she brought a folder of resources. Grant programs, local lenders, city incentives. She showed me how she'd gotten her first property funded and renovated. At one point, I must have looked overwhelmed because she reached across the table and touched my hand. "Don't let them make you think you're small," she said firmly. "You have a bigger vision than most people in this city." I swallowed. They didn't see it. They didn't want to, Grace corrected. But that doesn't mean it wasn't real. Her words hit me harder than I expected. After that, we met every few weeks. Sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to walk through neighborhoods where she was working on new projects. She'd introduce me to contractors, architects, people who were turning abandoned spaces into something vibrant and alive. One Saturday, she took me to see a building on the corner of 53rd and Ellis, a 4-story brick structure with boarded-up windows and graffiti scrawled across the entrance. "This was my first project," she told me, her voice soft with memory. "Everyone told me it was a waste of time. But look at it now." She pushed open the door. Inside, the place had been transformed, polished wood floors, bright lighting, small businesses tucked into every corner. A daycare center, a bakery, a women's health clinic. I walked slowly through the halls, my heart pounding. "How did you do this?" I asked. She smiled. "One small decision at a time." I didn't realize I was crying until she handed me a tissue. "You don't have to keep proving you belong," she said gently. "You already do." It was the first time in my life someone had looked at me, not my resume, not my family ties, and seen something worth investing in. The night after that tour, I sat in my apartment with the folder she'd given me spread out across the table. I started filling out grant applications, drafting a proposal, running numbers. I didn't tell my mom. I didn't tell Ethan. This was just for me. A month later, Grace called me on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. "Olivia," she began, sounding excited, "I mentioned your project idea to a friend of mine at the Community Reinvestment Fund. He'd like to meet you." I felt my breath catch. "Why?" I asked. "Because," she said simply, "he remembers you." I frowned. "I don't think we've ever met." "You have," Grace said. "Years ago, when you were volunteering at that housing clinic in Pilsen. You helped his mother get her eviction case dismissed. He never forgot that." I pressed a hand to my mouth. "I didn't even do that much," I whispered. "You did," Grace insisted. "You made her feel like she mattered." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed. For the first time, I understood that nothing I'd done had been wasted. Someone had been watching. Someone had seen. The first sign that something had shifted came in the form of a voicemail. I had just come home from another meeting with Grace and her colleague from the Community Reinvestment Fund. My head was spinning with numbers and timelines, but underneath it all was a quiet certainty. This was happening. I kicked off my shoes and checked my phone for missed calls from my mother. The last message was only 12 seconds long. "Olivia, it's Mom. Call me when you can." That was it. No hint of what she wanted. I let it sit overnight. The next morning, I called her back. She answered on the first ring. "Hi, Mom." "Liv," she exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath. "I've been trying to reach you." I saw. There was a pause. "Ethan told me he saw something online," she began cautiously. "About you buying property?" I felt my shoulders tense. "I'm working on a redevelopment project," I said simply. "Well, that's interesting," she replied, stretching the word like she wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. I waited. "It's a big risk," she continued. "Don't you think? Real estate is complicated. You could lose everything." "I know," I said calmly. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she added quickly. "You could still apply for something stable. Maybe at Ethan's company." I closed my eyes. "I'm not interested," she sighed. "You always were stubborn." "I learned it by watching you," I said before I could stop myself. The line went quiet. "Liv," she began again, her tone softer now. "I just don't want you to be disappointed." "I already was," I said quietly. "For a long time." She didn't have an answer for that. After we hung up, I thought that might be the end of it. But a week later, Ethan called. "Hey, sis," he began, his voice unnaturally cheerful. "Mom says you're trying to buy some old building?" "I'm not trying," I corrected. "I'm doing it." He chuckled like it was a joke. "Come on, Liv. Be serious. You don't have the kind of experience for something like that." "You'd be surprised," I said evenly. There was a pause. "Look," he continued, dropping the pretense. "I get that you want to prove yourself, but this is reckless. If you really need something to keep you busy, I can talk to my boss. There's an admin role opening up. My throat tightened, but not with shame. This time, it was anger. I don't need you to save me, Ethan. He sighed like I was being unreasonable. This is just like you. You can't ever accept help. This isn't help, I snapped. This is you trying to keep me small. His voice hardened. Whatever, Liv. When it falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you. He hung up. For a few minutes, I sat on the couch, letting the quiet settle over me. I thought I'd feel shaken, but all I felt was clarity. They didn't want me to fail because they cared about me. They wanted me to fail because it justified the story they'd always told about who I was: small, dependent, forgettable. 3 days later, I got a Facebook message from my Aunt Carol. Hey, sweetie, heard you're working on a real estate thing. So proud of you. Can you send me some info? I'd love to share it with the family. I stared at the message for a long time. Carol had never once called me after I moved to Chicago. The only time she reached out was when she needed something: an introduction to someone at the university, help filling out forms, a place for her daughter to crash. I could almost hear her voice in my head, bragging at the next family gathering. Well, Olivia's finally doing something worthwhile.
I didn't reply.
The following week, Mom called again. Hi, Liv, she began, her voice tight. I was thinking maybe you could come home for Easter. We could talk about everything. I think it would help if we all sat down together. I don't think that's necessary, I said gently. Don't be like this, she pleaded. It doesn't have to be a big deal. We're just worried about you. No, I corrected softly. You're worried about how it looks. Liv. I have to go, I said, my voice calm. Good night. I hung up before she could respond. A day later, Ethan sent a group text to me, Mom, and Aunt Carol. We all just want what's best for you. Let's not turn this into some drama. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I set the phone aside and returned to my spreadsheets. It was almost startling how quiet my mind felt. For so many years, I believed I needed their approval to move forward. Now I understood that their concern wasn't about me at all. It was about their discomfort with my independence. A week later, I got a call from Grace. How are you holding up? She asked. Better than I expected, I admitted. Good, she said firmly. Because the people who are threatened by your growth will always try to shrink you back down. Don't let them. I pressed my palm over my eyes, blinking back sudden tears. Thank you, I whispered. You don't owe them explanations, she continued. You don't even owe them updates. Let your results speak for themselves. And for the first time, I believed her. The first time I unlocked the door to the building that was now, and probably legally mine, I half expected someone to run up and stop me. It was a quiet Wednesday morning. The city was still shaking off the last cold fingers of spring, and the sun hadn't yet climbed over the rooftops. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute, staring up at the crumbling brick facade. 3 months ago, it had just been an idea, a line in my notebook, a fantasy I wasn't sure I had any right to entertain. Now it was real. The building smelled like damp plaster and old paint. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallways. The ceilings were cracked, and the floors sagged in places, but somehow, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt like I had come home. I spent the rest of the morning walking from room to room with my clipboard, making notes about repairs. In the back of my mind, I could almost hear my mother's voice. You're going to regret this, but it was softer now. Easier to ignore. By the time I locked up and stepped back into the daylight, my phone had 4 missed calls from Ethan. I didn't bother listening to the messages. Instead, I texted Grace. It's official. I have the keys. 2 minutes later, she replied. Proud of you. Let me know when you want to celebrate. I smiled, sliding the phone into my pocket. I spent the next weeks meeting with contractors, filling out permits, and applying for grants. Every day felt like a test I wasn't sure I would pass, but at the end of each one, I'd walk back through the building, touching the walls as if to remind myself this was really happening. One afternoon, while I was meeting with a structural engineer in what would eventually be the main lobby, a woman stopped in the doorway. She looked familiar, but it took me a moment to place her. She had been at the networking event where I'd first met Grace. Olivia, right? She asked, smiling. I nodded, brushing dust off my hands.
I'm Marisol, she said.
I just wanted to say, I heard what you're doing here. It's incredible. Thank you, I said, surprised by how much it meant to hear that. My brother lives in this neighborhood, she continued. He told me this building used to be a community clinic before it was abandoned. A lot of people have been hoping someone would bring it back. I didn't know that, I admitted. She nodded. I think you're exactly the kind of person this place needs. After she left, I stood in the dusty lobby for a long time, thinking about all the invisible threads that had led me here, the jobs I hadn't gotten, the people who hadn't believed in me, the rejections that had almost broken me. Maybe they hadn't been obstacles. Maybe they'd been redirections. A week later, Grace stopped by with coffee and a folder of grant applications. She was smiling as she handed me an envelope. What's this? I asked. Open it. Inside was a handwritten note. Olivia, thank you for what you did for my mother. I never forgot your kindness. If there's anything I can do to support this project, please let me know. Carlos Rivera. My throat closed. Grace touched my arm gently. He's pledging $20,000 to your renovations. I blinked at her, speechless. He said you were the only person at that clinic who treated his mom like she mattered, Grace went on. He wanted to repay that. I sank into one of the folding chairs, pressing my hand to my chest. I didn't even think he'd remember me, I whispered. Grace smiled. People remember how you made them feel. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to win over people who would never value me. All the hours I'd wasted proving my worth to people who never intended to see it. And here was a stranger I'd helped once, offering me more support than my own family ever had. That night, I walked the building alone. The sun was setting through the broken windows, painting the floors in long bands of gold. I could almost feel the ghosts of everyone who'd once walked these halls, patients clutching appointment cards, nurses calling out names, kids chasing each other around their mother's legs. I closed my eyes and imagined what it would look like restored. A clinic again, or a co-op, or a daycare. A place that belonged to the community, not some faceless corporation. And for the first time in my life, I felt sure, unshakably sure, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. When I got home, I found a voicemail from Ethan. Look, Liv, he began, sounding tired. Mom's worried sick. We don't understand why you're shutting us out. This isn't who you are. I deleted it without listening to the rest. It wasn't who I had been, but maybe it was who I was becoming. 3 days later, I opened my email to find another message. This one from Marisol. Hey, just wanted you to know. My brother says everyone's talking about your project. They're grateful you're here. Don't let anyone make you feel small. I read it twice, tears blurring the screen. I thought about all the times I'd felt invisible. All the ways I'd twisted myself into knots trying to belong. And now, standing in the middle of my own second chance, I finally felt seen. Not because I'd performed or achieved or pleased anyone, but because I'd shown up as myself. It was a Saturday morning when they showed up. I was in the middle of reviewing flooring estimates with my contractor when my phone buzzed. Mom, we're outside. Please come down. My heart gave one startled thud. I looked through the front windows of the building. Sure enough, my mother's sedan was parked at the curb. Ethan stood next to her on the sidewalk, arms crossed over his chest, like he'd come prepared for a confrontation. For a moment, I thought about pretending I wasn't here. But something in me was tired of hiding. I turned to my contractor. Can you give me a few minutes? Sure, he said gently. I took a steadying breath and walked outside. They both looked up when the door swung open. Olivia, my mother said immediately, her voice brittle with forced cheer. Can we talk? I stopped 3 feet away from them.
About what?
Ethan took a step closer. About all of this. He gestured vaguely at the building behind me. About what you're doing. I'm redeveloping this property, I said calmly. My mother's mouth tightened. Liv, you have to see how reckless this looks. You're shutting us out. You won't answer calls. You won't let us help. I folded my arms. Help? Is that what this is? Of course, she said too quickly. We're worried about you. We just want you to be realistic. I looked at her carefully, seeing her in a way I never had before. She didn't look malicious. She just looked small, afraid. And in that moment, I realized her fear had always been the blueprint she tried to hand me. Her fear of standing out. Her fear of failure. Her fear of not being invited back in. I'm not interested in being realistic, I said evenly. Ethan frowned. Liv, you can't keep doing this alone. It's not sustainable. I felt something in me settle. I'm not alone, I told him. I have people who believe in me. People who've actually shown up. My mother flinched just slightly. This doesn't have to be ugly, she said, her voice dropping. We're just trying to talk. I'm listening, I said. She hesitated. We thought maybe you could come home for a while.
Take a break.
Regroup. I shook my head.
No.
Ethan scowled. Don't you think you're overreacting? No, I repeated, softer this time. There was a long silence. My mother pressed her lips together. Liv, you're making a mistake. I let the words drift between us without grabbing for them the way I once would have. It wasn't my job to prove her wrong. It wasn't my job to convince her. It wasn't my job to rescue her from her own discomfort. You're allowed to think that, I said gently. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't understand why you're shutting us out. I'm not, I said. I'm just not letting you define me anymore. Ethan let out an impatient sigh. This is unbelievable. I met his gaze. You don't have to understand me, Ethan. But you do have to respect me. He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. No, I said again. It was the easiest word I'd ever spoken. They both stared at me like they didn't recognize me. And maybe they didn't. I took a slow breath and felt a warmth in my chest, something like relief. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't owe them access. I didn't owe them my peace. Without another word, I turned and walked back into the building. My contractor was waiting just inside the door. He raised an eyebrow in question. Everything okay? He asked. I nodded. Everything's exactly as it should be. He smiled. Ready to get back to work? I glanced back once through the glass. My mother and brother were still standing on the sidewalk, watching. But for the first time, their disappointment didn't feel like my problem. I turned away and let the door swing shut behind me. That evening, as I was locking up, my phone buzzed with another message from my mother. We don't know who you are anymore. I read it twice, then set the phone down. I stepped out into the warm night air and felt something uncoil in my chest. I wasn't the same. That was the point. Sometimes I walk through the building at night, long after the contractors have gone home. The hallways are quiet except for the hum of the new wiring and the occasional creak of the old floors settling into their second life. I'll stand in the main lobby, once a cracked tile wasteland, and look up at the ceiling we've just restored, the brass pendant lights glinting overhead. And I think about the version of me who stood on this sidewalk months ago, clutching a folder of grant applications, terrified she was about to humiliate herself all over again. I wish I could tell her that it's okay to be underestimated. That sometimes being invisible to the wrong people is exactly what you need to become visible to the right ones. I wish I could tell her she didn't have to carry the burden of everyone else's disappointment. But mostly, I wish I could tell her that the life she was building, quietly, stubbornly, was worth all the rejection. Because it was. It still is. The day the final inspection was approved, I sat alone in my office on the second floor. The walls were painted a soft cream, the windows polished until they gleamed. I could hear the laughter of the new tenants moving in downstairs, a cooperative daycare, a small counseling center, a bakery. This building used to be a monument to everything I thought I'd never have: stability, purpose, belonging. Now it was proof that sometimes the best way to win is to stop asking for permission. When my phone buzzed that afternoon with yet another message from Ethan, "We really don't understand why you're doing this to us," I didn't even feel angry. I felt free. Because I finally saw the truth. I wasn't doing anything to them. I was simply doing something for me. And I think maybe that's the part people can't stand when you finally claim your life, the realization that you were never waiting for them to approve it. If you're listening to this, if you've ever been the person who was overlooked, who was told to be realistic, who was fed the lie that you were too sensitive, too ambitious, too much, I hope you hear me now. You are not too much. You are simply too real for people who prefer the comfort of their illusions. And you don't have to keep shrinking to make them comfortable. You don't have to keep explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You don't have to spend your one precious life auditioning for an acceptance that will never come. You can say no. You can walk away. You can rebuild everything they told you was impossible. You can become the kind of person who doesn't need an invitation to belong. Because belonging was never theirs to give you. It was yours to claim. I used to think that success looked like an office on the top floor of someone else's building, a polished resume, a family that finally said, "We're proud of you." Now I know better. Success, for me, is the quiet knowledge that when I unlock these doors every morning, I'm not pretending to be someone else. I'm not performing. I'm not begging to be seen. I am simply standing in a space I created, flawed and beautiful and real. And if there's one thing I'd want you to take from my story, it's this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop knocking on doors that were never meant for you. Sometimes you have to build your own. And sometimes, when you least expect it, your kindness will come back to you in ways you couldn't have imagined. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if every plan will work. But I know this much. I am no longer afraid of who I am when no one is clapping. I am no longer afraid of being misunderstood. I am no longer afraid of their disappointment. And if you're standing at the edge of your own life, wondering if you're allowed to want more, let this be your sign. You don't need their blessing. You don't need their applause. You only need your own permission to begin. That is enough. You are enough. Always.